I'm Margaret Mountford. I'm Paul's successor as president of the Hellenic Society, and it's great to see so many people here on this freezing night. I think it's marginally warmer in here than it is outside, but I wouldn't place any bets on it. And we're very fortunate that Paul has come this evening to give us his presidential lecture. Now, introducers always start by saying, and Paul Cartledge needs no introduction, and then they proceed to give them one for about 20 minutes. I'm not going to do that. You've come to hear Paul, not me. And Paul is going to talk about Pericles, which is going to be fascinating. And anyone who heard his online lecture series on democracy knows what a wonderful speaker he is. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Margaret, Fiona, other officers of the Society, fellow members, whether you're here present, I'm delighted you are, or whether you're going to view and listen to the recording online, or both, surely not. Anyway, welcome and thank you so much. So I'd like to begin by dedicating this talk to the memory jointly of my former Oxford doctoral supervisor, who is a stalwart of the Society, Professor Sir John Boardman, and of my long-time Israeli friend and colleague, Professor Gabi Herman, both of whom sadly have crossed the sticks this year. At least I hope they have, and they're not waiting on this side. Well, it is, I think, and I hope, a happy convention, whereby in the year following her or his tenure, the immediate past president of SPHS is invited to give a presidential lecture. I had the fortune to succeed Judith Mossman, but it was in the middle of the COVID pandemic in 2020. And so I spent the first 3 years of my tenure under varieties of lockdown, and I agreed to do a 4th year when restrictions on in-person gatherings were thankfully easing. It was often rather dispiriting for all concerned, but the Society soldiered on, thanks above all to the absolutely indispensable Fiona Hara being at the helm, a true gobernatrix, if I'm allowed a Latin word. And I was absolutely delighted to be succeeded by Margaret Mountford, than whom I could not have imagined a more perfectly suited and qualified personage to serve in the office. She has just overseen and chaired the first of her council meetings, and I'm relieved to see that she's still in one piece, or at least on the surface. I had no hesitation when I was asked for the title of my talk to you this evening. My last but one book was on democracy, ancient, especially of course Athenian, but not only, and modern. And I'm currently finishing off a book for a new series that I edit for Reaction Books of London, series entitled Great Lives of the Ancient World. The first 2 in the series have only just been published. They're on Archimedes and on Plato, respectively. Mine is to be entitled Pericles, Statesman, Demagogue, Eccentric. And that's the subtitle that I'm going to be exploring and expounding a little with you shortly. Like the so-called beautiful game, which it often actually isn't, my talk will be a game of 2 halves. First, a few words on the structure of this talk, and then on its subtitle, Revisiting Biographical History. Then, slideshow devoted to trying to bring out what I consider to be the basic contextual essentials of the Athenian democracy into which Pericles was born in or about 495 BCE, and whose sometimes extreme vicissitudes he either lived through or arguably shaped until his death, aged about 66, from the effects of the Great Plague in late 429 BCE, the 3rd year of the Atheno-Peloponnesian Great War. As I go through the slides, I shall bring out any particularly Periclean associations or references using Periclean, inverted commas, in a purely descriptive sense, that is, meaning having to do with Pericles. Because I shall, of course, be coming back to Periclean, inverted commas, in its other senses, because that's the overall main point of this entire talk. And that will, in fact, be the subject matter of its second half. But before the slideshow, let me first try to explain what I mean by revisiting biographical history. It's a case for me of revisiting because in 1987, based on a course of undergraduate lectures at Cambridge, I published with Duckworth a lengthy monograph entitled Agesilaus and the Crisis of Sparta. Now, I'd wanted it to be titled King Agesilaus II to remove any possible ambiguity over which Agesilaus and which crisis was in question. But my redoubtable maverick publisher, Colin Haycraft, classicist and rackets player extraordinary, would have none of it. Now, the implied interrogative problematic of that book was, of course, to what extent was Agesilaus himself personally responsible for Sparta's crisis, and more particularly its resolution in a very bad way for Sparta in the 360s and 350s. Agesilaus was a true macrobios. He lived from about 445 to 360, 359. He had an extraordinary career that, usefully for me, encompassed both Sparta's victory in the Atheno-Peloponnesian War and its decisive defeat in battle by Thebes in 371, and consequent loss, almost at a stroke, both of half its city territory and of its former great power status. To answer that overarching question of agency, responsibility, meant going into the issue of great person, usually great men or man, historiography, and considering the extent to which event-making individuals really do cause things to turn out the way they did, or merely play key parts in shaping those events one way or another, subject to immovable, inflexible, economic, social, intellectual, ideological, etc. constraints, which are beyond even their control. That in turn meant raising the issue of biography as history and as opposed to history. And this is where the absolutely most fundamental historical issue of all, the question of sources, of evidence, comes up to bite us. There's a huge modern literature on the genre of biography, mainly literary biography, for which Hermione Lee, for example, has laid down a decalogue of principles to be observed by literary biographers. But I, as an ancient historian of Greco-Roman antiquity and an archaeo-historian, I am anything but a literary biographer. And Agesilaus, coming as he did from the cultural desert of Sparta, was anything but a literary or even literate figure himself. So what sort of biography, if any, could one write of him, given the available source materials? It so happens that one of the earliest extant ancient Greek attempts at quasi-biography is Xenophon's posthumous encomium of the king, his patron and friend. But ancient Greek biography really took off as a genre rather later, and it achieved its floruit, its acme, only much later, in or around 100 AD CE. In the work of Plutarch, who needs to be confronted head-on and up front, which I do delightedly, since he's been my companion and guide for many decades now, since my London school days back in the 1960s, and since he's such a good read. I mean, anyone who could write as he did, who'd rather take his pleasure relaxing with the most beautiful woman, rather than staying up all hours with Xenophon's Panthea, or Aristobulus' Timoclea, or Theopompus' Thebe? Well, anyone who can say that can't be all bad. He might have been saying it, of course, tongue-in-cheek. And just as a little bit of an in-house in-crowd info, there's to be an In Our Time program on Plutarch's lives on December the 19th, Thursday, December. You've heard it here first. But, and it's a very big but, Plutarch was emphatically not a historian. Not even one as that role was typically defined in his own day, as opposed to the day of the 5th century, the day of Thucydides and Herodotus and Pericles. And he himself was at pains to point that out right at the start of one of his very best parallel lives, the life of Alexander the Great, which of course he paralleled with Julius Caesar. He starts it off by saying, "I write lives, not histories," by which he meant that he was, like his Roman contemporary Tacitus, interested primarily in character, in mores and morality, in teaching or suggesting lessons by biographical examples drawn from the careers, but also the personalities of great event-making men, both Greek and Roman, of the past, whom he contrasted on various grounds. For writing my Agesilaus book, I was therefore fortunate to be able to use one of the extant Plutarchan lives, one of the 23 pairs that he wrote and that has survived. And he compared Agesilaus with Pompey the Great, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. That choice of pairing seems to me perfectly reasonable and defensible, even a little bit flattering to Agesilaus. But what of the pair, the Plutarchan pair, that directly concerns me here and now as a historical biographer or a biographical historian of Pericles, namely his life of Pericles, which he paralleled with that of the Roman consular and general Quintus Fabius Maximus? Well, I'm tempted even to say there's no comparison. What did Plutarch think he was doing? No comparison of personality, of situation, of importance, or of lasting influence and legacy. But actually there is one, except it's a modern point of comparison, likeness. Both Periclean, inverted commas, and Fabian, inverted commas, are conveniently included in a Wikipedia listing of people who've given their names to something or other, or had their names used classificatorily and non-descriptively. To give another ancient example, Augustine, from Roman Emperor Augustus. And the reason for the modern choice of Fabian by a socialist society advocating gradualist reform, not revolutionary transformation, is the same reason Plutarch saw fit to compare the eponymous Fabius with Pericles, namely their caution and their self-control. Fortunately, Plutarch went well beyond that relatively minor point of comparison. And by dint of being exceptionally industrious, exceptionally well-read, and having an exceptionally retentive memory, he wrote what is, on his and general ancient criteria, pretty much as good as it gets in terms of ancient biography. That, however, is still nowhere near good enough for him to comply with Hermione Lee's biographical prescriptions. For example, Plutarch tells us virtually nothing of Pericles' first 20 or so years, presumably his most formative years, which is a potent way of saying it's impossible for anyone today to write a modern-style biography of Pericles, that is, of his inner as well as his external life. The best we, that is, anyone can do, and I'm trying to do this, to keep you in suspense no longer, is a life and times external biography. Exactly how one does that is, of course, quite another matter, and I'm going to return to that in the second half of this talk. But first, a little slideshow, just 10 or so slides, which I'm going to speak to without a text. So you can see on the screen actually the American cover of my democracy book, 2016 originally. The UK edition has the full colour original. It's a painting by a German history painter called Philipp Foltz in the mid-19th century. Why would a German history painter be any at all or especially interested in, well, as you can see, Pericles addressing the assembly beneath the Acropolis of Athens? Answer: in 1832, Greece, having thrown off the Ottoman yoke, which it had laboured under for some 370 years, became an independent or semi-independent nation-state. But the great powers, in their wisdom or unwisdom, imposed a German, specifically a Bavarian monarch upon Greece, a man whose name in German was Otto, in Greek Othon. And Othon attracted and deliberately surrounded himself with a kind of court of German-speaking and including the man who brewed his beer, just to give one example. He liked his lager. At any rate, Philipp Foltz painted a whacking great painting, which is in Munich, which is, of course, where Otto came from, in southern Germany. And it shows right in the center Pericles. You've possibly seen this many, many times online. If you access a modern discussion of ancient democracy online, you'll very often find this painting illustrated. And to me, the most odd thing about it all is that Pericles is wearing a helmet. So did he really, when he went into the assembly, put a helmet on his head? Well, he was a general for many, many years, and so he might have wanted to make a point about being a general. But unlike Augustus, I mentioned him, you probably know this, whenever he attended the Senate, he wore a breastplate so that he would not suffer the fate of his adoptive father, Julius Caesar. Yes, I kid you not. At any rate, we'll come back to him. So now this is a century after Pericles, but it illustrates a couple of points I want to make about democracy, how the ancients, and especially Athenians, did democracy in ways that are totally alien to ours, even though we use the word democracy, which we borrow from the ancient Greeks. So it's a law inscribed on a very handsome piece of Pentelic marble with an iconographic scene above. And the scene represents a seated, what shall we call him, gentleman, rather buff, but not in the spring of his life, not in his salad days, but well middle-aged and with a very full and strong beard. So he's, as it were, Mr. Average Athenian citizen of 336 BC, which is when this law was passed by the Athenian assembly, ratified by a body called the lawgivers, and then inscribed, possibly, very possibly, by an unfree and enslaved person whose job was to inscribe public laws and decrees. Who is the lady, fully clothed, standing behind Mr., as it were, Demos, Mr. People, wearing fancy dress and crowning the gentleman who is seated? Well, she is none other than Demokratia. And I think there are very few of us who think about our democracy with such awe and respect that as a system of self-governance, we worship it. The ancient Greeks quite literally worshipped a personification of their political form of self-rule. The year 336 is absolutely critical because it's 2 years after a decisive battle which the Athenians, together with the Thebans, rather rashly undertook to fight against Philip of Macedon, Philip II. And the threat of the victory was that Philip would exact upon Athens the same punishment that he exacted upon Thebes, which was end of the democracy, replacement, regime change with a form of oligarchy, the oligarchs being Philip's yes men. End of Thebes' wall and rather a surrounding garrison, so that the Thebans would be utterly defenseless were Philip to want to come back and give them a hard time. Suppose the Thebans wanted, as they rashly did a few years later, to revolt. Athens, by comparison, was treated with leniency, but the Athenians were afraid that what happened to Thebes would happen to them, and specifically that Philip would impose a tyrant, a single individual, utterly beholden to Macedon, autocrat, the antithesis of democracy as they understood it. Because they understood their founding event. How come Athens had a democracy? Well, way back when, 2 Athenian aristocrats killed a tyrant, actually the brother of a tyrant. And after that, Athens became a democracy. They put the two together. It wasn't actually a correct putting together, but nevertheless, democracy for the Athenians was anti-tyranny. It was the antithesis of tyranny. What is demokratia? Well, it's a portmanteau word, 2 Greek words, demos, kratos. Kratos is unambiguous. It means power, strength, force, might. Question is, who's holding it and against whom or over what? Well, the demos is ambiguous and ambivalent. In the broadest sense, it means the entirety of the Athenian adult male free citizen population. And it's something like Lincoln, when he got up to speak on the battlefield of Gettysburg in 1863, and he spoke of government of the people, by the people, for the people. And then one thinks, hang on, just which people were governing the United States in 1860? Not many black people, not many female people. So it's one of those lovely words which says more and less than it really should. So there was that inclusive sense of demos. There was also an exclusive sense, and this is where demokratia acquires a very different colour and hue and feeling. Because demos could also mean the masses, the poor, the many. So imagine you're one of the elite, you're one of the well-born, the rich, the well-educated, and you think the smart. And yet you're outnumbered just automatically by the many, the masses, the majority, who are, in your view, stupid, not well-educated, fickle, and from a very poor background, and above all, poor. Aristotle, when he was writing his Politics, just about the time of this decree, said democracy is the rule of the poor over the rich. That was for him a sociological explanation of what democracy. So imagine, as I say, you're not one of the demos in that sense. You might well think democracy's pretty ghastly. And there was, throughout the time of the 5th and 4th centuries, an undercurrent, sometimes came to the surface, of people who wanted to overthrow the democracy, and they successfully did it a couple of times. Aeschylus. Well, the reason I put him on twofold. First, we go to the theatre. It might be a political play by David Hare. It might be. But we don't go to the theatre as an act of politics, as doing politics. The Athenians did. They didn't go to the theatre very often, twice, 3 times a year. But when they did, it was part of a religious ceremony, and religion and politics were absolutely solidary. And they went there to learn, partly, how to be a good democratic citizen. Well, Aeschylus was the first great of the 3 greatest tragedians. And in 473-2, he was chosen by the senior official of the Athenian state to be one of the 3 playwrights who were competing in the next spring's Great Dionysia Festival with 3 tragedies and a satyr drama. One of those 4 survives, 473-2, The Persians. I won't go on about it, I've written about it, there's a ton of stuff available. Point is this, who was the man funding Aeschylus? The chorus needs costume, it needs rehearsal time and rehearsal space. Aeschylus needed a few props. He needed somebody to play the music that Aeschylus composed and which he also choreographed, and so on, all that stuff. Well, the choregos was the person that the state said, you're so rich, one of your duties must be public contribution by the way of funding one of the chosen playwrights at the next Great Dionysia Festival. For 472, the chosen choregos was Pericles, his first known public political act, when he was about 23. Language of politics, I won't dwell on this. My point is that pretty much every word of our English political vocabulary, whether it's ideological, descriptive, or analytical, comes either from the Greek or the Roman, but that can be very misleading, as I pointed out in the case of democracy. All ancient forms of democracy were direct. All modern forms of democracy are representative. We, the people, do not rule or govern. We choose people to govern for us, in our interests, we hope, but certainly instead of us. Ancient Greece was not modern Greece. There were about 1,000 separate political communities. Only about 100 plus can we be absolutely sure that at some point between, let's say, 500 and 300, a city, one of these 100 plus, had some form of democracy. Athens, I believe, was the earliest. Athens had 3 or 4 different democracies during its 180 odd years of democracy. And so when we say, as some people do, and I'll come on to this, that in some sense Pericles was an exemplar of Greece, not just of Athens, we have to think very carefully what exactly is meant by that. Now, getting closer to the nitty-gritty, on the left, though really he should be on the right, is Plato, because he was, in our terms, very right-wing, whereas Pericles was very left-wing. I'll come back to why, how, and what that meant. Plato, this is very crude and summary, thought that politics was an art and a science dependent on knowledge. And since, by definition, the majority were either ignorant or too stupid to understand what Plato believed to be the essentials for knowing how to govern, knowing what governing was, the essence of ruling, Plato was an anti-democrat. And he had one particular personal reason for being virulently anti-democratic from the time that he was about in his late 20s. His mentor, Socrates, was put on trial for impiety and found guilty, not by a great deal, but significantly. And then when the toss was argued, what penalty should Socrates suffer? Socrates apparently made a hash of it, and more people voted that he should be put to death than had voted him guilty in the first. Anyway, Plato was utterly disgusted that that is how the masses should treat the wisest, as he thought, the wisest human individual he had ever met. But for the gentleman on the right, I would not be standing in front of you now, because he is the founding father of historia, history as an art, if you like, a science, at any rate a practice. And I put Herodotus up there because he is the founding father. But the one that I'm actually more interested in today, for reasons we'll come back to, is the one on the other side, facing that way, Thucydides. This is a herm. It's now in Naples, so it's Roman period. It's nice stone, but whoever had the idea of this is absolutely brilliant, because without Herodotus, no Thucydides. But their conceptions of how to write about the past were diametrically opposite. So they're looking in exact opposite directions. And Herodotus is also here because it's in his histories that the word demokratia first exists, is first attested. Herodotus was the historian of the Persian Empire, and especially of the Persian Wars, the attempts by successive kings of Persia to incorporate mainland Greece in an empire which already stretched as far as what's today northern Greece, Macedonia. This is, if you like, I mean, if there were an image, a poster that you'd put up in Athens as a hate figure, rather like in 1984, Goldstein, this is the equivalent that the Athenians would come and hate Darius, because he's an absolute monarch and his subjects are slaves. So the notion of equality, citizenship, freedom, in the eyes of the Athenian democracy and democrats, absolutely alien to them. You may or may not be able to see, but there's a rope which is linking every single one of these defeated enemies, and he's standing on one of his defeated enemies. This is in northern Iran and virtually invisible, but the symbolism is absolutely perfect. Anti-democracy. And then I'm going to end with this slide, because Pericles himself did not promulgate and therefore have passed many laws. Now that's not surprising, because Pericles was one of a group of politicians. He didn't just act on his own, and you could have supporters propose various measures, whether they are pragmatic or whether they're ideological. And I'm actually going to mention a couple that Pericles did propose and were passed. And one of them was to introduce pay for the people who were empaneled by lot, that's very democratic, to serve in the jury courts, the people's courts, from the late 460s onwards. Pericles in the 450s proposed, to begin with, quite a small sum, but it might have made the difference between whether somebody could afford to take the time off to serve in the court and do his public political duty or not. And so these are the sorts of tokens that if you were an empaneled juror, you'd pitch up with your ID card, which happens to be a bronze pinakion, it's called in Greek. And this belonged to Demophanes, who came from Kifisia. And Kifisia is where if you've been to Athens recently or to the Olympics of 2004, the stadium, the Olympic Stadium, is built there. And it's from Kifisia that the single, and it's pretty much the only recent piece of direct evidence for Pericles, has turned up, and it's on a cup which was drunk out of by several people in a tavern just about when Pericles was fairly young, with his brother and with others, and they all scratched their name in the cup, which miraculously was excavated not long ago from Kifisia. Well, I'm now going to go back to my first slide. And we come to the second half of tonight's talk. Well, in my title, I put Periclean, inverted commas, as applied to Athens, democracy, and Greece, in scare quotes. All of those phrases have actually been used. Periclean Athens, Periclean democracy, Periclean Greece, by reputable scholars in reputable publications. There's quite a Pericles or Periclean publishing industry, as you'll have gathered. I've even seen the moniker, the age of Pericles. And that's what first got me thinking back to Voltaire and his siècle, that is age, of Louis XIV, which he published in 1751. But hang on, Louis, unlike Pericles, was not living in, let alone under, any sort of democracy. He was an absolute monarch, not a mere politician or statesman. So to see the French, even the European 17th century, he reigned for a very long time, as in some useful sense his, wasn't too big a stretch. Where then does the apparently congenial idea of Pericles as having achieved so much, enough to justify equating his name with a mode of governance, a whole city, even a whole culture or civilization, where does that idea ultimately come from? Well, in two words, Thucydides and Plutarch. That is from the contemporary history of Thucydides, son of Olauros, Pericles' fellow Athenian, and from the very much non-contemporary, and as we've also seen, not historian, Plutarch, who was composing in his native Boeotian backwater, Chaeronea, in about 100 CE. Well, I'll come back to Thucydides. That's why I've given you the handout. I'll explain why I gave you that later. Because I have an idea that it's just one sentence of his brilliant revisionist, sadly incomplete work that's probably ultimately the text most responsible for the idea of Pericles being a sort of uncrowned king of Athens. First, though, let me set out briefly the plan of my Pericles book and relate it to Plutarch's biography, because as I did in my Agesilaus book, I'm going for a basically thematic approach that is the opposite of, say, Thucydides' year-by-year analytic, chronologically sequential approach. First, of course, I have to give a preface, acknowledgements, illustrations, chronology. Then we get to the meat, the prologue. Why Pericles? Why bother? Well, here I shall be reviewing the recent biographical historical tradition, which begins with the 1891 biography by Evelyn Abbott in a New York Putnam's Sons series called Heroes of the Nation. Hang on, there wasn't a Greek nation. What's going on here? Okay, we'll let that pass. But was Pericles a hero? Well, that's one of the questions I'll be asking and trying to answer. Chapter 1, Pericles for and against. So there I'll be looking at the evidence, registering that thanks mainly to Plutarch, we know that there was a contemporary, strongly hostile anti-Pericles current of thought, not least in Athens. It was partly ideological, it was partly pragmatic, and it was partly personal, very personal. And this is quite unlike the modern reception of Pericles, which on the whole as I'll show later on, is very favourable. The historical Pericles is chapter 2, and here I provide a basic outline, a chronologically ordered narrative summary of Pericles' times and his life within those times, from about 495 to 429, fleshing it out with accounts of the major episodes with which he was variously involved. And that is to provide the essential background to the thematic chapters which follow. First of all, chapter 3, the fictional comic Pericles. I mean that Pericles is a figure who is in himself comic, but it's designed to make clear that the dominant democratic discourse of the day, apart from the funeral oration, was comedy, though it only happened a couple of times a year in Athens, in the theatre of Dionysus. Well, in contemporary comedy, Pericles was guyed, satirized, caricatured, abused, in other words, treated no differently than any other leading Athenian democratic politician. But what sort of politician was he? And that brings us on to chapter 4. Pericles the politician, orator, commander, and statesman in scare quotes. Now those descriptors, orator, commander, obvious. Statesman's in scare quotes, because this is what is underlying my quest. Why is Pericles thought of as being in some sense a statesman, not a mere grubby politician? But before I get to that, chapter 5, Pericles the builder. Plutarch's life is the main written source for the role of Pericles within the entire building program on the Acropolis, below the Acropolis, elsewhere in Attica, started in 447, continued until his death, and after his death, well after his death. Well, Plutarch, interestingly, doesn't actually credit him, as other late sources do, with overall supervision of the entire massive project. But there's no doubt that building was one of Pericles' principal preoccupations. The Odeum, singing hall, the third or middle long wall from the city of Athens to Piraeus, they were explicitly Pericles' babies. But what of the building program as a whole? Well, you have to read my book to find out. Chapter 6, Pericles the politician revisited and subtitled The Demagogue. Now my point here is that Pericles was no less a demagogue than any of his rivals or successors. And he was a demagogue in the sense in which Moses Finley, back in the 1970s, rightly identified the demagogues as a structurally indispensable feature of the Athenian democracy as such. In other words, ordinary Athenians could not have functioned as good citizens without the leaders of the people. That's what demagogos means. But because there were critics really hostile of democracy as such, Thucydides was one of them, the word demagogue acquired, and it still has, a negative connotation of misleader of the people, of rabble-rouser, of populist, all the words that are not equivalent to statesman. Chapter 7, some surprises here. Pericles the lover. Plutarch's the main source yet again. And we discover, if you read Plutarch's life, a lot of stuff about him alleged by his contemporaries that doesn't normally find its way into, if you like, straight modern accounts of Pericles. For example, friends of his allegedly arranged assignations for him, reminiscent of JFK in the White House, as it were. One comic poet even allegedly prosecuted his partner in life, Aspasia, and she was accused of being the power behind the throne, the bad girl, whorehouse madam, who prompted Pericles into taking all sorts of bad public decisions, so thereby seriously undermining the, as it were, positive picture of Pericles sailing along uninterruptedly on the surface, as it were, as a public figure. And then chapter 8, the intellectual Pericles. Again, what little we know about him as an intellectual is mainly from Plutarch's biography, and I'll be coming to that anon. And then penultimately, that is, as I look at the book, Pericles' legacy. And here I'll be mainly exploiting the excellent book by Vincent Azoulay about 10 years ago, who traced the tradition of representations of Pericles from his contemporaries, the comic poets, Thucydides, through the later classical period, the Hellenistic, etc., right down to the 21st century. And as I've said already, mostly the modern post-1891 tradition is positive, but there is one very strong standout exception. Some of you may have known him, Peter Green, who died very recently. He was just a couple of months short of his 100th birthday. And in 1972, he wrote a very disobliging account of Pericles in the context of an essay on the Parthenon and the reactions to the effect of the Parthenon on the Western cultural tradition ever since. Then finally, back matter, further reading, endnotes, reference, consolidated bibliography. So, last section, where does that leave us on the Periclean question? I conclude with a brief review of what I think he did and what he could and could not do, all by himself, or shall we say, with but a little help from his friends. Well, it's not often realized just how unconventional, eccentric Pericles was. Thanks to Thucydides' glowing portrait of him, we tend to imagine Pericles as an ideal Athenian democrat, admittedly rather richer, cleverer, and better educated than the average citizen, but still a politician and statesman who represented the views of Mr. Average Athenian and had their full backing as he led them through their golden years from about 460 to about 430. Actually, the truth is rather different. When he was only 23 or so, I've already mentioned this, he funded a set of 4 plays by Aeschylus, which included the Persians, which has survived, the earliest surviving Greek tragedy. Now, Aeschylus and Pericles, therefore, won first prize. The prize was voted in a democratic vote. But the unnamed hero of the Persians was Themistocles, and Themistocles was unceremoniously booted into exile only a couple of years or so after Aeschylus's play was performed. A decade further on, when he was still a young man in Greek political terms, he's in his early 30s, Pericles threw his backing behind a major set of democratic reforms, championed by a man called Ephialtes. The reforms were passed, ordinary Athenians achieved even more direct political power thereby, especially through the courts, but Ephialtes himself was murdered, assassinated. So Pericles had to watch his back. One reason for the hostility towards Pericles from conservative circles was that he was seen as a class traitor. He'd been born an aristocrat into the same family as the founder of the democracy, as the founder was recognized, but he had, as it were, crossed the house. He'd embraced the cause of radical democracy against what most of his fellow aristocrats and fellow wealthy Athenians took to be their own best political and economic interests. There's a pamphleteer who was writing probably just a few years after Pericles' death, thanks to Gilbert Murray. We call him the old oligarch. Well, that pamphleteer singles out such people, such class traitors. He doesn't mention Pericles, but clearly has that sort of person in mind for a really powerful vituperation. Pericles, moreover, kept controversial company. Free thinkers, such as Anaxagoras, who was also a foreign Greek. He came from Clazomene to Athens, and he kept company with, was said to have been taught by, innovative musicians, such as Damon, who challenged traditional ideas. And nowhere was he more unorthodox than in his private life, insofar as a politician such as Pericles could have such a private life. He married, first of all, conventionally, an upper-class Athenian woman. What was her name? We don't know. Absolutely typical of our evidence for elite women. Having 2 legitimate sons with her, he then divorced her. Again, that's not utterly uncommon. But rather than remarrying another upper-class Athenian woman, he preferred to set up house with a foreign Greek woman, another one from Asia, Asia Minor, Aspasia, who came from Miletus. Now, it's possible that he married her. If not, Aspasia would have been what the Athenians called his palake, his concubine. What is certain is that by a law of 451, a law which he himself proposed, the son that he had with Aspasia, also called unimaginatively Pericles, was legally not an Athenian citizen, because after 451, any child born to be an Athenian must have both an Athenian citizen father and an Athenian citizen mother, and be born in legal wedlock. That son was, as I say, not an Athenian, but Pericles' 2 legal sons, and he himself, all died of the plague. So that the Athenian people was asked specially to legitimate Pericles Jr. So again, eccentricity. The radically anti-democratic Plato wrote a dialogue. It's called the Menexenos, Pericles long since dead. And he imagines that Pericles, the great Pericles, who we imagine was capable of writing his own speeches, in the dialogue Menexenos, Plato imagines Pericles having to be taught by Aspasia how to write one. Even the building with which, apart from the Odeon, he was probably most closely and personally associated, namely the Parthenon, was also a highly controversial building, so controversial that it occasioned a very serious attack on him by another Thucydides, a Thucydides son of Melesias, Pericles' principal opponent in the 440s, and it came to a showdown between them, and Thucydides lost. And so Pericles was not ostracized as Themistocles had been, but Thucydides was ostracized. So that's an example of the risk Pericles took by becoming so involved with that building program. What the Athenians who didn't like it, what the allies of Athens who didn't like it had against it, 2 things. One, its expense. Why wasn't the money spent in other ways, or less money spent in other ways? And secondly, isn't it a bit too much about Athens, as opposed to either Athena, the notional person who's given this temple, and isn't it too much about Athenians? Who are these human figures parading around the frieze? On no other Greek temple are real human beings depicted on a temple. I can discuss with you, if you're interested, the issue lying behind that. Very difficult problem. But at any rate, My point is the Parthenon is exceptional. Who was the principal or one of the principal artisans? Well, a personal friend of Pericles, Phidias, who certainly did the cult statue, gold and ivory, may have been responsible for the sculptural scheme of the frieze and elsewhere, the metopes, the pediments, etc. But certainly was found guilty of peculating, of stealing gold allocated by the state for the sculpture of Athena, found guilty, forced into exile. So Pericles ran risks in terms of his associates. And then finally, I suppose the biggest question of all, was Pericles, or to what extent was Pericles responsible for the outbreak of the Atheno-Peloponnesian War? Not so much the conduct of it, because he died very early on, but this was a war which, as everyone instantly recognized, changed everything. The Greek world of the Eastern Mediterranean simply was not the same and couldn't be ever again as a result of that, as it were, world war. Well, Pericles, as we'll see, and I'll turn to it now if you've got your handout in front of you. Pericles was found wanting. The Athenian demos voted on his instructions or advice to resist any Spartan attempt to persuade them that the Athenians were guilty of breaking a peace with the Spartans, and therefore that the Athenians were guilty of starting the Peloponnesian War. Pericles said, no, 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 it's the Spartans who've really broken the peace by attacking us in the Peloponnesian War. This is an exceptionally complicated issue, but the war did not go well in the first 2 years. Plus, the Great Plague hit Athens in 430. And the passage I've put on the handout, it's thanks to Robin Waterfield's forthcoming translation. He very kindly said I could use it. You'll see right at the beginning, the whole population stayed angry with Pericles until they'd punished him with a fine. Now, another source says they didn't just punish him with a fine, but they fined him on top of deselecting him from the office of general, which I think is probably correct. So somebody prosecuted Pericles. He was found guilty and fined. But now Thucydides, our source here, this is his obituary notice of Pericles, because he uses the death of Pericles, 429, as part of his explanation of why the Athenians eventually lost the Peloponnesian War, which tells us Thucydides was still alive in 404, even though his work stops in the middle of 411. He died before he could complete the last 7 or 8 years of the war. So Thucydides is very important as the source of this text, because he was very much not a supporter of democracy. He rather was a supporter of Pericles against the stupid or unreasoning, fickle Athenian masses who, having first voted for the war, then they voted against Pericles, and then they reselected him, typical of the masses. That's full of aristocratic, anti-democratic contempt. Now, this is where, and this is the point of me giving you this text, comes the modern image of Pericles as not being like any other contemporary Athenian politician. He was a statesman, they were merely demagogues and rabble-rousers. Why? Because Pericles was foresighted. I've emboldened that. He was incorruptible. Implication, all other Athenian leading politicians were on the take. He was not in it for what he could get out of it, e.g. wealth. He didn't need to, of course, but he was incorruptible. And above all else, and this I think is the key, it's in subsection 8 of chapter 65, he led the demos rather than being led by them. So for Thucydides, what democracy is when the demos leads the politicians who lead them, rather than vice versa, and lead them badly, because the masses are stupid, ignorant, fickle, and they're in for what they take to be their own best interests. And so we come right at the bottom of the first page of this handout to the one sentence which I think is ultimately the explanation of why Pericles is singled out as holding not just a different, but a unique position, both within the Athenian democracy and within the ancient Greek classical world as a whole. How you translate it is sadly incredibly controverted and controversial, because Thucydides was the reverse of limpid and unambiguous. What Robin's given here is one version, which I think gets the right emphasis, because what Thucydides does is draw sharp contrast on the one hand, on the other. And the contrast here is between, on the one hand, Demokratia, on the other hand, Pericles, whom he calls the first man, actually in the gender sense. So for Thucydides, thank goodness, the Demokratia, yes, it was a democracy, contradicted himself, in my humble opinion, because what had happened immediately before Pericles' death? Yes, he'd been deselected, and that means democracy was working as it should. Even the great Pericles could be deselected. And yes, he was re-elected, but the masses had then made the point, Pericles, you watch your step. We voted for you in 431. We supported you 430, up to a point, and things are not going well now at all, so you'd better watch your step. That, I think, is how I would read that. So, to conclude, the judgment of posterity has tended to side with Thucydides against his contemporary and relatively few more recent critics, not least because of the magnificent funeral oration, which Thucydides, of course, wrote. He put into Pericles' mouth. And here, that scene very clearly is under the Acropolis. This is the assembly. But if you look online, if you look for this picture, you'll find it captioned quite often, Pericles delivering the funeral oration, which actually happened in the Kerameikos, way down below the Acropolis. And this is my ultimate point, really. What then was it that Pericles most contributed that makes him such an influential, event-making, yes, if you like, a hero? And it was what Plato rather grudgingly referred to. He called Athens the Prytaneon of Sophia. It's in a dialogue with Protagoras. That means the civic hall or the mansion house of high culture, of wisdom. Well, it was quite significantly due to Pericles and his associates that Athens became such. And because it became such, it's that Athens that has had the most influence through Alexandria, through the Romans, through the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, right through, dare I say, to 1879, when this society was formed. So if you have been, thank you for listening.